Hello, can you hear me? Hi, thank you for coming and thank you for moving up to the front. Since there's not so many of us, we wanted this to be a discussion anyway, so I think this will work very well. My name's Lori Shantz. I teach journalism at the University of Oregon, and this is part of a series of 5 panels that are exploring engagement issues and supported by the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon, which we call our gathering place for innovation and civic engagement. And we'd like to thank the International Journalism Festival for supporting this and for making our panels happen. I think what's been very interesting since I've been going to things when I'm not preparing this, is that these kind of issues about engaging with communities, about building trust with readers and viewers and listeners, this has been coming up in a lot of contexts, not just in the panels that are specifically labeled engagement. So I'm glad to see that, and I'm hoping we can add to the larger conversation that's been going on here. The way we're going to approach this is going to be a little bit different. A lot of the conversation about engagement is about approaching things differently and trying some things that are new, taking advantage of new tools and technologies and social medias to reach our readers. What we're going to talk about here is looking at how we already interact or engage with our readers. And this is readers, viewers. I'm a writer, so I'm kind of defaulted that way. But we already interact with them, but can we engage with them, and how do we do it? And as a journalism teacher, I teach my students to question everything and to ask why and to ask, can we do this better? Can something work better? So that's the approach we're going to take on this panel. So our mission here is to say, what can we learn about how we engage and interact with readers, viewers, whoever's on a daily basis, by how we conduct ourselves at a high intensity, high profile, high visibility event. In this case, mass shootings or a mass tragedy. So that's where we're going to start. My colleagues, Bruce Shapiro, Catherine Gildenstad, and Jim McMillan will fill in a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about how my work and how this panel came about, and then they'll continue from there. It was October 1st, 2015. And I was taking students to an event called Experience Engagement, which was done by our Agora Journalism Center and Journalism That Matters. And this was a gathering of journalists, academics, students, also community leaders, business people, government workers, some politicians even, and also artists and musicians, and a wide variety of the community, all coming together to ponder this question. What is possible when the public and journalists engage to support communities to thrive? Literally, while I was taking students in the car to Experience Engagement, 180 miles south, a student walked into his English classroom at Umpqua Community College and fired. He shot 18 people, 9 of them died, 9 of them were injured. The gunman was killed on site. So while I'm on my way, I find out that 2 students are not coming to Experience Engagement anymore because they've been called by national media outlets to be freelancers. And having never covered a tragedy before, they got in the car and they drove south to Roseburg. And I knew they weren't the only people. That what happens when one of these high visibility shootings, tragedies happen, the media shows up. This was a small town, Roseburg, about 20,000 people. A very rural county, a timber industry. It's a timber town. When the logging went away, a lot of jobs went away. This was a county and a town that is so close-knit that the reporters at the local newspaper say you can't have anonymous sources because everybody knows who you're talking about every way. And what was happening was the entire national media was coming down there. And the juxtaposition was so striking. I'm in a room with people discussing how can we improve the relationships between journalists and the communities that they cover, at the same time that hundreds of journalists were descending on a small town that they knew nothing about except there had been a tragedy there, and that they were going to begin to do this. I was sitting with colleagues, and President Obama came on, and he gave the typical statement that he gives after every mass shooting, and I'm sorry to have to say those words. And what he said was, very angrily, somehow this has become routine. And he called out the reporting as something that was routine. And so my colleagues and I started thinking, what can we learn from this? What don't we know? So we decided that what needed to be told was the story of how the coverage is done. So we found 19 Oregon area journalists who covered the shooting that day at Umpqua Community College. 5 of them were students who had never covered anything like this before. One of them was a photographer, a 30-year veteran of covering communities in Oregon, who had previously covered a school shooting in 1998 at Thurston, about 6 months before Columbine. Another reporter was Eli Saslow from the Washington Post, a national correspondent who was based in Portland and who, much to his chagrin, had become a national mass shooting beat reporter. This was the 4th one he had covered. And the question was, what can we learn from this routine? How are we engaging with communities at these moments? One of the things that was striking is that the 19 journalists we talked to were unanimous. They said, I'm sorry? Not yet. The 19 journalists who we spoke with unanimously said that we are here because we want to support this community. We want to tell the stories of the victims so that they're not forgotten. We want to talk about the things that are happening right in this town. Who are the people? Were there heroes? Are there people helping? What's happening here? And they said they thought it was important to the community that their stories be told. What we discovered from interviewing people and from the communities is that the public disagreed with this, and that they wanted the media to go home, and that the same reporters who were there to listen to stories and to try to help were actually causing harm. And a month after, Oregon Public Broadcasting did a piece, and they looked at, they interviewed people from the community and from the schools, and one of them said that the media had inflicted a second trauma upon the town of Roseburg. And that rather than doing good, that what they had done was they had caused problems. A year later, on the 1-year anniversary of this, there were campus security guards ticketing journalists who had come to cover the anniversary and putting on the tickets that said no media parking, even though the parking was for the public. They wanted them to go away. What was interesting also is that the journalists themselves realized that something wasn't quite working, that they felt, and Andrew had spoken about this in a previous panel, Andrew DeVagal, with Gideon Rosenblatt's levels of engagement, that this was very transactional, that people came and that they wanted to get some information. And there were moments where one young woman, 2 reporters talked to her, it turned into 5, it turned into 10, it turned into 20, it went on for 45 minutes. There was a pastor whose daughter was in the classroom, and she believed she was saved by one of the students who was killed because he laid over top of her, and his blood made her think that she had died also. The pastor, her father, did one-on-one interviews after his sermon with 22 individual TV reporters who showed up. So there's a lot of things that were happening that were not quite, that the journalists themselves were uncomfortable with, that they had qualms about. More than half of the journalists my colleague Nicole Dahman and I spoke to said that they felt funny asking questions because they would not have wanted to answer them in the same situation. And we have here, I didn't want to go up and interview them. She didn't know what she would say about this. We have another radio reporter who described herself feeling that she was a bird of prey descending on a little mouse. The other thing that we learned from this is that the journalists were relying on their muscle memory, that people go off and we cover things all the time. And everyone went and they used the same type of things that they do on a daily basis. I interviewed people, I talked to people, I do the same type of things. It's muscle memory. And what this leads me to is if we're talking about being able to engage with readers, and if we're talking about establishing a trust that's been missing, How do these interactions happen? When we talk about this, we often talk about this at a big level, right? That there's fake news, that there's a distrust, there's a political disconnect, there's something else. But what are the day-to-day interactions of reporters doing that may change or cause something different in that type of trust? And what that comes to is that if you look at how change happens in organizations, or change happens, that there are values that can be debated. This is according to educational psychologists, but there are also assumptions that are embedded so deeply that we don't ever question them. So what we're trying to do is to question that. Why do we talk to someone right after a trauma? Why do we show up in the car outside of somebody's house immediately after? Why don't we stick around? How do we cover a vigil? What do we do? And those are hard questions to answer. They're hard questions to ask. And I'm not going to tell you that I know the answers, but I wonder, and I'm now at the stage where I'm beginning to interview community members who were interviewed, if these kind of processes, if we should be rethinking these as part of our commitment to try to engage and build trust with readers. So that's where we're headed now. Bruce, we'll go over to you. Bruce from the Shapiro from the DART Center is going to tell us a little bit about just in general trauma journalism, how it's changed, where it's going.
As I was saying, I was heartened to hear the extent of reflection from many reporters, and also at the same time disheartened because we have been learning and relearning the lessons of mass shootings and mass atrocity events for 20 years now. I'm going to try to distill some of that into the next 5 minutes. I am a journalist. It's all I really know how to do, but for the last few years I have been the director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia Journalism School in New York City. Founded in 1999, the DART Center promotes evidence-informed best practice and innovation in reporting on violence and conflict and tragedy. It's our belief that these stories and the questions of engagement, of whose stories get told, why and how, go to the heart of any democratic society. The most important decisions our societies make are about violence, whether to go to war or not, how to protect children, how to prevent intimate partner violence, migrants and refugees. All of these, on some level, are about not just the act of violence, but the long aftermath of it. So we're devoted to helping the public understand that through the work of journalists. We also were the pioneers in the growing field of trauma awareness, the impact of covering violence on news professionals, and how we as journalists can stay resilient, and what the duty of care of news organizations really is. We are a global organization. We work here in Europe through DART Center Europe, which is based in London. We work across the Asia-Pacific region through our node based in Melbourne and in other parts of the world as well. We have an annual fellowship program. We sponsor annual awards in North America, of which Eli Saslow was actually the winner of last year's DART Award for his astonishing coverage of the recovery of one of those shooting victims. He embedded himself with a single mother and her daughter for months on end, very, very difficult period, and wrote beautifully about it. We sponsor research. We work with clinicians and researchers and others to do top-level research on the impact of trauma on journalists, on the impact of news coverage on communities, and so on. And we do a lot of topic-specific workshops, including most recently a 4-day program in Chicago on covering gun violence. So this is stuff we think about a lot. Our website, dartcenter.org, I encourage all of you to go to it, has a wide range of resources, tip sheets, all kinds of stuff, and I'll circle back to that question of mass casualty incidents in a minute. I would just say that mass shootings, we've been working with now for close to 20 years at the Dart Center. And at first it felt like an American problem. We began looking closely at reporting on the Columbine school shootings in Colorado, at the similar mass casualty events, at the Oklahoma City bombing, press coverage of one American thing after another. I know in that period in the 90s I was covering abortion clinic shootings and bombings. It was kind of a rough time. But in fact, this is a global problem. Here I have a few pictures. We have the Rose March in Oslo in the aftermath of the Utøya shootings. The Wiener Zeitung, a really wonderful local newspaper in Winnenden, Germany, which marked, which on the day after the Winnenden school shootings there simply put the front page that you see, Warum, as its as the whole front page of the newspaper. A remarkable, imaginative, and determined effort to treat that school shooting with dignity. The Bataclan at the bottom, and then in my own neighborhood, Sandy Hook in Connecticut. I grew up not far from Sandy Hook. I still live about 45 minutes away. The town was on my first beat, on my first newspaper job, so that one hit home for me. These incidents aren't going away, and they do challenge our toolkit as journalists. So let me propose 10 lessons, and I'm going to go through them quickly, and then we'll have time for conversations. First of all, mass tragedies matter. They are not just any story. When an individual or a small group of individuals run amok with guns or bombs, it goes to the heart of the social contract. We are talking about events that are not far away on a battlefield, not a half a world away in some civil conflict zone, but in the places we presume to be safe. A community college, a nightclub in Paris, an elementary school in Winnenden, a summer camp on Utøya Island. These are the safest places in the world. And when the contract is violated by these acts of violence, people look for scapegoats. They feel the moral underpinnings of their societies in question. And sometimes important policy changes result. These are not just any story. When these shootings happen, one of the first things that happen is that people rush to the scene and try to find out what happened. And if there is one lesson for breaking news coverage, which is a lot of what Laurie was talking about, in the immediate aftermath from Columbine, from Sandy Hook, from every single one of these shootings, it's what my friend Dave Cullen, a Dart Center Ockberg fellow who wrote the great definitive account of Columbine, I think of this as the Cullen rule. He says, everything you find out in the first 24 hours is wrong. And the consequences of reporters as news breaks getting these facts wrong are sometimes profound. After Sandy Hook, many news organizations tweeted out the name of the wrong individual as the shooter. It was the brother of the real shooter. Similar misidentifications have happened after other events. The number of casualties, who's dead and who's alive. So be really conservative. And now, with the speed of social media, correct the record. I personally believe that when news organizations encounter the social web racing ahead of the true facts, it's part of our job to slow people down. 3, about the shooters themselves. Every mass shooter is different. Make no assumptions. We always want to put the mass shooter into a familiar box. This is a mentally ill person. This is a terrorist. Some mass shooters are mentally ill. Some are aggrieved domestic partners or aggrieved workers. Some have a political agenda, whether it is ISIS or something else. But we should make no assumptions, because much of the time people turn out to be blends of all of these different backgrounds, and it takes a while to figure out what the motivations really are. 4, keep Act 2 on page 1. Aftermath is news. A friend of several of ours on this podium, a guy named Frank Ockberg, MD, a psychiatrist in the US, likes to talk about the 3 acts of trauma news. He says there's Act 1, which is the breaking news, and most of us as reporters kind of know how to do that in the transactional way that Lori was describing. But for survivors, for communities, for families, there is a long Act 2, which may involve psychological aftermath, issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, which may involve arguments over how to memorialize or how the law enforcement system should respond. And then there's kind of an Act 3, too, which is the long, deep changes that sometimes occur in communities as a result of these shootings. And if I stand for anything here today, it's getting past the bang bang and getting past the police yellow tape as the definition of what counts as news. Act 2, the long aftermath of violence, is filled with newsworthy events, with issues that help define our societies, and we've got to cover them. 5, remember the local reporters. Or another way of putting it, every tragedy is a local tragedy. One of the interesting things that happens with a study like yours is that, or often with even the responses in communities, is that people talk about the media, capital T, descending on a community. But in fact, there's 2 kinds of journalists. Yes, the national press descends, the international press descends. In my ethics class, by the way, at Columbia University, I now banish all talk of the media, capital T, capital M. We're here to talk about journalists and news organizations and the choices that we make. Okay. Local reporters are deeply connected to these stories. Very often their own families and colleagues are among the victims, are personally affected. That was true in Virginia Tech. It was true in Benenden. It's true in Sandy Hook, where one of the teachers who was killed was the daughter of a local newspaper editor and a reporter at another local newspaper. So the same reporters who were covering funerals for victims in an objective way, presumably, were then going to the wake and funeral of their colleague's daughter. And that's true in every one of these mass casualty incidents, and we forget that at our peril. 6, investigate and narrate. It is tempting simply to take official sources to get the stories out. Here's what happened today. Here's what the cops are saying tomorrow. Here's the trial. But every mass casualty event is an invitation to investigative reporting. These are nuanced, complex, rich events that reward the most profound reporting, and too often our profession skips over those opportunities. 7, handle images with care. We are in a new era with a flood tide of user-generated content, much of it quite graphic, from mass casualty events. It's always been true that which pictures you choose to publish and promote shape what we think about an event. Are we showing pictures of rescuers and responders or bloody corpses, or both? What's the argument for pro and con? But now there's a new thing, which is that we are burdened with enormous volumes of graphic images that need to be verified, that need to be edited. I'm not going to do a long thing on this today, but on the Dart Center website there are 2 excellent tip sheets on self-care when handling graphic images, and how journalists and editors and producers need to think about the impact of an overwhelming load of toxic imagery on themselves as well as on the public. Ethics matter. Now, it's easy to say that. That's always true in journalism. But when you have a mass casualty event like a school shooting that violates the basic core elements of the social contract, journalistic ethics and violations of journalistic ethics do become, as Lori said, a kind of second wound. Now, we're not causing the foundational trauma. It's the death of children. It's the death of people at a nightclub. That's the foundational trauma. But because survivors' sense of ethics has already been breached, what we may think of as the normal aggressive steps we take to kind of assert our authority and get the information we need, that transactional kind of journalism that Laurie discussed. Any ethical breach in there gets seized upon, and we do that at our peril. It is also of particular consequence to journalists ourselves. There have been very important studies in the last couple of years showing an association between a breach of journalistic ethics in the aftermath of highly traumatic stories and long-term PTSD or other psychological injuries in journalists. It's a field that psychologists are now calling moral injury. I'm happy to talk about it later, but when we as journalists get tangled up with a sense of complicity in the violation that a mass casualty event brings, the psychological consequences for ourselves can be quite profound. So when we attend to ethics in these high valence situations, we recognize that we're talking to individuals and families who, whatever their original status, have lost the basic power over life and death or the life and death of their children. So we think about what do we do differently with people who maybe don't have the kind of power our toolkit is well suited for when we go to talk to police chiefs or corporate executives. And we also think about how would I want my own sister or brother or child treated in this moment. And we do so knowing that it has consequences for those whom we are talking to as well as for ourselves. And good ethical practice protects everyone. And again, I can talk more about this. 9, practice self-care. Be a good colleague. We've learned a lot over the last 20 years about the impact of covering overwhelming traumatic events on journalists. We're a pretty resilient tribe, as it turns out, but we also can be afflicted over time by issues like post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a lot of evidence that practicing good self-care, lots of tip sheets on the Dart Center website about that, and peer support among colleagues is the most important protection against psychological injury. You can go to find a trauma therapist. There's a lot of other things you can do, but it begins with self-care and peer support. So we talk a lot about that at the Dart Center, and it's a crucial lesson. After the Sandy Hook shootings, for example, journalists organized themselves into kind of just informal discussion groups to talk through what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what are we going to do differently, and what would we tell our colleagues to do differently the next time. That gives people a sense of control over the event. And people also took colleagues aside and said, you seem to be having a rough time. You want to talk to somebody about it? There's a way to be a good colleague. And finally, lesson 10, and this is kind of a new one in just the last year or so, have a strategy for online hatred and craziness. We live in the era of trolls and conspiracy mongers, and those kind of folks who've always been with us seize upon these mass casualty events as occasions to project their own resentments and fantasies, and very often direct that anger at us as journalists. It's a toxic stream. We as a profession have not yet figured out exactly how to handle it, but both standing up for the facts and resisting the sort of conspiracy theories that say the Sandy Hook shootings never happened or that the Bataclan was somehow a false flag operation, or Utoya was a false flag operation. We need to resist that with factuality, as we as journalists do. We also need to find ways of changing our audience engagement strategies to not reward the trolls and the maniacs. And I do think there's something a little wrong when reporters at major dailies and major websites, their promotions depend on audience engagement, and yet audiences too often are dominated by the most polarizing, misogynistic, racist, and polarized voices. So this is an area where some real innovation is needed. I'll have a lot more to say, I'm sure, when we move to questions, but let me just point out that among the many resources on the Dart Center website, there's a whole section devoted to tip sheets in covering homicides and mass shootings, filled with reporter-to-reporter lessons learned from Columbine, from Utoya, from Vinenden, from plenty of other places, and also researchers and clinicians adding their reflections to help us have an evidence basis for making sound news choices. I'll leave it there.
Bruce, can you flip us back?
I can try.
Okay.
Is that where we want to be?
Yep. Yeah, next, well, you can sit here. You're fine, or go up.
I'm fine. Shall I just start?
Sure. This is Jim Shapiro from Temple University, and he's going to talk, oh my goodness, no, Jim McMillan, I'm sorry, from Temple University, who has done some non-traditional reporting on gun violence in Philadelphia and is going to give us a little bit of a different framework for this kind of thing. Thanks,
Great, thank
Jim.
you. Hi, everybody. So I work at the Klein College of Media and Communication in Philadelphia, but I spent 30 years as a newspaper and wire service photojournalist. And although in the past 8 years, I've been running some local news projects, including one that I'm going to talk about, and I teach a course now and then. My work is largely informed by the DART Center. I'm a former DART colleague. It's been 10 years already.
Still a dark.
We're all
Once and always.
exactly. And I also want to thank Lori and her colleagues from the University of Oregon for bringing me along on this trip, and it's great to meet Catherine and all of you. So when I was first invited to participate in this panel, I thought, well, I've covered a lot of mass casualty events, way more than my share. I was deep at ground zero on 9/11. I spent a year at the war in Iraq, and I could go on, but none of them were really community events. Certainly not my community. And so there weren't great opportunities for engagement. There weren't great responsibilities for doing things wrong when I was kind of parachuting in. But then I started thinking about it some more. And well, first I want to talk about, like, what's the definition of what is a mass shooting? In the U.S., the FBI calls it a mass murder if we have 4 or more victims. There's no official guideline for a mass shooting, so maybe when 4 or more people are shot, doesn't matter if they live or die. It's sort of a media invention, so that's the first hazard. So for example, just 2 weeks ago in Cincinnati, Ohio, 15 people were shot in a nightclub one night. It was a passing headline. And as I thought more, in the year 2000, I covered what we know very well in Philadelphia as the Lex Street Massacre, 7 dead, 3 wounded. But it was hardly national news. And then I thought, oh, I did do more. We had a mall shooting in New Jersey near Philadelphia, a mass shooting in the 90s. And I covered a workplace shooting when I worked in Boston in the 1980s. They become so completely normalized that in 2009, I was on holiday in upstate New York, and there was a mass shooting at a workplace in Binghamton, New York, and I went by just to visit friends who were there working because that was the most important aspect of the story to me. It's been horribly normalized. In Philadelphia, thank you. Okay, so in Philadelphia, I'm a little bit ahead, but that's close enough. On Monday night, this week, there were 4 people shot one night. 3 of them died. We had in one incident, and we had another similar incident about a month ago. But usually, they're separate shootings. They're separate incidents, separate victims, though not really unrelated. So this is just a graph of shootings from 1 week on a project I'm going to talk about in September 2014. In a city of 1.5 million, we had 13 people shot one night. 7 or 8 many other nights, only 1 day all month without a shooting victim. And that's pretty much how it goes. We have an average of 3 to 5 shooting victims per day, about 1,200 per year. About 300 of them will die on the day that they were shot. I would argue that it's an urban slow-motion mass casualty incident and endless and excluded from the typical narrative of U.S. mass shootings. I think it's a failure of journalism. So in 2012, from 2012 to 2014, Sonia? I launched and led a local project in Philadelphia we called the Gun Crisis Reporting Project. Our tagline, if you can see the screen, it's pretty small here, says that we were seeking solutions to the epidemic of homicide by gunfire in Philadelphia. And I'm going to also talk about this project on a panel on solutions-oriented journalism tomorrow morning. I'm going to talk about the solutions aspect at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. But tonight I want to focus on our effort at advancing best practices and covering that violence during the gun crisis years. And that was informed by my DART studies and also by studying and teaching and trying to practice peace journalism in the years that followed. The first thing you notice is that almost all of the gun violence was covered primarily by local television daily news reports. And that no matter whether there was 1 incident or 3 or 9 or 12, they generally, each station in Philadelphia would cover 1 per day. So there are all sorts of misrepresentations taking place. There are typically, in my experience, three very common routine scenarios that happen most often. There's the downtown shooting where cameras can juxtapose the victims and the suffering with, pricey restaurants and shoppers and well-heeled professionals, well-dressed professionals. And then, but that's, that's another misrepresentation, because most of the shootings happen in our neighborhoods, in Philadelphia and a lot of similar cities. In Philadelphia, a young black man is facing a risk of being shot to death hundreds of times greater than I am. In fact, the rest of us are facing a homicide rate in Philadelphia lower than the national average, while we lead the nation in most years among large American cities in terms of our rate per capita. The response when the shootings happen in the neighborhoods, there are two kinds. There's the lockdown, where everybody goes inside and locks their doors and shuts off their lights, because those with the guns rule the neighborhoods, and nobody else can be seen talking to the police or to the press. And then there's another kind where everybody comes out and stakes their place on the corner. But whether the neighbors are out or not, the press is in the same place. There'll be a crime scene perimeter and investigators inside, and then higher level police officials and information officers huddled on one corner with all of the journalists right next to them. Because they come with one question every night. They don't come to ask, how does this happen? Why is it like this? How will we stop it? When will it end? They have one question. They say, who's talking? They say, who's talking? Because they're under pressure to produce a package by a deadline that requires a soundbite. And I'm not saying they don't care, but it's not their top priority. So what do they hear? Well, before I get into that, but I mean, they're out of step. And of course, in this sort of reporting, the victims are defined by their death, not by their life. I have another, I don't know if you can see it from here. This is the actual text that a police official sent to his colleagues to report the incident I mentioned on Monday night. And what's in there is what's in every story in Philadelphia: the time, location, age, race, gender, injuries, medical condition, the hospital they were raced to, and what medical condition they were in. That's it. The police never say anymore, because the journalists almost never ask anymore. So this is the whole story most people get most nights. So at the Gun Crisis Project, we tried to do it differently. We tried to engage audiences, not with the wonderful digital tools I'm hearing about in other sessions here, but I'm talking about shoe leather reporting and engaging people face to face, breaking from the pack. My colleague Joe Kazmarek, a photojournalist, did most of the field work on this project, and 2 or 3 other people, while I did most of the editing. But when they tell us to go home and they're angry, we'd resolve confrontations, would explain our mission, what we're trying to do, and make friends that way. We treated the people in the neighborhood as the experts that they are. We asked them for solutions and how we were going to solve this problem together as a city. I often complied with takedown requests if the community said, I don't want to be part of that story. Sometimes we had to weigh it against the public's right to know, but it's something that doesn't happen ever at traditional news organizations in my city. The reporters in the field would brief me from the scenes, and we'd debrief afterwards. We didn't plan this, but we used this to try to not only take care of each other, but to see what we could learn about dealing with the community face-to-face instead of just taking the police statement. Our content was deeper too. We had lots of reactional reporting, and that got a lot of the page views. But our solutions reporting got most of the social sharing. But we also had personal stories, we covered community events. I did a lot of data analysis. I was adherent to solution strategies that I'll talk about tomorrow. We curated local social media, or in other words, we listened to the audience, the community, online as well as face-to-face. We had site engagement tools where neighbors could leave a voicemail message that we would then post on our site. And the outcomes were pretty dramatic. A lot of our reporting didn't just come from the perimeter around the crime scene, but from inside the homes nearby. We got names, we got stories. A very real metric, I'd say, is that we got hugs. We got lots of hugs, not something that happened when I did the same sort of assignments for a newspaper in Philadelphia. We won lots of professional awards, but we also won community awards for the first time in my life, one that called us Partners in Peace. It's kind of unforgettable. Kind of makes the journalism awards feel smaller. On the next level, the city council came in, and no, it didn't come in. The city council, the legislative body of the city of Philadelphia, invited us in twice to talk about solutions. And I wasn't a guy with sway at City Hall. After we did that together, the city council funded two of the programs we suggested. They hired a couple of the experts we suggested. And then some other important things happened, of course. They found the money, they hired the field workers, they did the heroic face-to-face work of violence intervention. But a year later, homicides in Philadelphia dropped by 25%, a historic 25%. I believe that we're an important catalyst. Impact analysis is not simple. I'm only claiming correlation. I'm not overclaiming. But also, unfortunately, I can report that there's correlation with the end of our project. That I can wrap. With the end of our project, that when we stop doing it, rates have gone back up. So yeah, if we're running short on time, I'm going to hand off to the next to Catherine. And if we don't have discussion time, I'd love to talk to anybody who'd like to talk afterward.
Thank you. I'm wondering, I would like to hear from you. How many of you agree with the sentence that Laurie said, that they found out that journalists are the second trauma on a community? How many of you in here would agree on that? Yeah, I think it's the majority. That was the realization that made me, maybe I should have the clicker. That was the realization that made me want to change what I did in journalism, understanding that I was part of the traumatizing part, how I influenced society, how I influenced the sources that I interviewed. And my journey started with a homeless woman and not a shooting victim, but I'm thinking it could have been a shooting victim. A homeless woman who I had labeled as a victim in my story, and that informed the way I interviewed her. My questions were exploring the victimizing part of her story, how difficult it was to be homeless. She was an American lady. It was during the recession years. But she refused to be a victim. She said, I have learned something. And then my interview went in another direction. But it just left me reflecting that I didn't want to be the victimizing part. That was not why I came into journalism. And understanding that the labels we put on sources, how that informs the interviews we do, and maybe that we are growing victimization in society is the reason why I work with constructive journalistic methods today. And one of the things, the one thing that I want to share with you here is how we do it interview-wise. This is a very provocative sentence for most, but we teach our students to think, kill your victim. Of course not in a real sense, but in their heads. Challenge your own understanding of what a victim is. Are people really victims, or do they have something else to tell you? So killing the assumption that people are automatically a victim is something we teach at my journalism school at Windesheim University in the Netherlands. And briefly, how do we do it? We introduce them to, you could say, 3 stages of being a victim, 3 levels of being a victim, because a natural question from you would be, well, if you are in a mass shooting and you just saw your loved one or your child being shot, aren't you a victim? And I would say, yes, you are. Then you would be at stage 1. Stage 1 is where there's no growth and the traumatic event has just happened. I'm not sure if you could ask questions like, what did you learn and how did you move from there? In that situation, it has something to do with timing. Then we have the level 2, where the so-called victim has experienced growth, but they don't recognize it yet. It's your questions in the interview that harness or start the reflection in them. And maybe you've all done interviews where that happened. When it happens, it's kind of magical because the interview really becomes surprising. Your source is pausing, they're thinking back, they're saying, oh, that's a good question, I've never thought about that, but when you ask me, I'm thinking. That kind of interview, that's stage 2. And then we have stage 3, where the person in a traumatic event has realized that they have grown from it, or they have learned something, or they've moved on. And that's level 3. So killing your victim is something we teach our students just to make them conscient about it. We shouldn't be the victimizers. And we should try to ask, where are the people on this ladder that we're interviewing? So that's the start, I think, to work on this. And that's what we do at Windesheim University. Thank you.
Do we have time to take a couple questions or no?
here now.
Yeah.
Who has the
Who's-
mic?
who has
Is there a mic somewhere in the room?
Someone have, we will. Okay.
Only been here.
Yeah, we've been here for 40 minutes.
You talked about one of the traumas is that there's so many reporters descending.
We're just streaming your meeting.
Okay. So many reporters descending on a crime scene. There's also a lot more talk around collaboration in journalism. Do you think we could get to a point where, much in the same way that a sporting event has credentialing and there's kind of a pool of reporters who cover the president or who cover a sports event, could we get to a point where there's a pool of reporters who cover a mass crisis so that we're not doing 12 interviews with the same person?
Actually, that happens quite a bit, and there is a lot of responsible practice around pool interviews. Sometimes that gets violated, especially you'll get international press who come in and offer to pay victims for interviews and things like that. But it's becoming more common for journalists to pool. This has been going on for 15 years. And by the way, related to that and to some of what you all were saying, actually I would like to push back slightly against the idea that we inflict the second wound. It is true that people often feel that way. And when journalists commit really bad practice or when there are 20 reporters asking the same question, they will feel that way. On the other hand, people would feel even more wounded, or do feel more wounded, when no reporters are there, or when the story goes uncovered, as very often happens in the kinds of communities that Jim has specialized in. So actually, I think that people project onto our whole profession a sense of social violation. And they also project onto it hope. They want, trauma is about approach and avoidance, about wanting to shout to the stars, but also being persuaded no one will believe you or can listen. We get caught in that whipsaw. And innovative, good reporting practice, things like pooling, a simple measure, things like shifting the power in interviews, the kind of thing, Catherine, you were just talking about, or the kinds of unusual steps that Jim takes, can go a long way towards saying to people, we're part of the solution to the social contract violation. We're not actually the problem. That's how I view it.
I wish we had more time, but thank you very much. I would just like to leave you with this idea that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all. In the same way that we talk about engaging with our audiences and engaging with that we need to think that there's not one way to do this, and maybe taking some of the slow news and some of the other things from the other panels we went today can give us some better practices for going forward. So thank you so much.
One down, one to go.
Short hour,
Yes.
especially for those of us who tend to talk too much. But
There's a problem with all the events of the festival.
they really should be a 1 hour.
Striking. I'm in a room with people discussing how can we improve the relationships between journalists and the communities that they cover, at the same time that hundreds of journalists were descending on a small town that they knew nothing about except there had been a tragedy there, and that they were going to begin to do this. I was sitting with colleagues, and President Obama came on, and he gave the typical statement that he gives after every mass shooting, and I'm sorry to have to say those words. And what he said was, very angrily, somehow this has become routine. And he called out the reporting as something that was routine. And so my colleagues and I started thinking, what can we learn from this? What don't we know? So we decided that what needed to be told was the story of how the coverage is done. So we found 19 Oregon area journalists who covered the shooting that day at Umpqua Community College. 5 of them were students who had never covered anything like this before. One of them was a photographer, a 30-year veteran of covering communities in Oregon, who had previously covered a school shooting in 1998 at Thurston, about 6 months before Columbine. Another reporter was Eli Sassow from the Washington Post, a national correspondent who was based in Portland and who, much to his chagrin, had become a national mass shooting beat reporter. This was the 4th one he had covered. And the question was, what can we learn from this routine? How are we in that's been going on here? The way we're going to approach this is going to be a little bit different. A lot of the conversation about engagement is about approaching things differently and trying some things that are new, taking advantage of new tools and technologies and social medias to reach our readers. What we're going to talk about here is looking at how we already interact or engage with our readers. And this is readers, viewers. I'm a writer, so I'm kind of defaulted that way. But we already interact with them, but can we engage with them, and how do we do it? And as a journalism teacher, I teach my students to question everything and to ask why and to ask, can we do this better? Can something work better? So that's the approach we're going to take on this panel. So our mission here is to say, what can we learn about how we engage and interact with readers, viewers, whoever's on a daily basis, by how we conduct ourselves at a high intensity, high profile, high visibility event. In this case, mass shootings or a mass tragedy. So that's where we're going to start. My colleagues, Bruce Shapiro, Catherine Guildenstad, and Jim McMillan will fill in a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about how my work and how this panel came about, and then they'll continue from there. It was October 1st, 2015. And I was taking students to an event called Experience Engagement, which was done by our Agora Journalism Center and Journalism That Matters. And this was a gathering of journalists, academics, students, also community leaders. Hello, can you hear me? Hi, thank you for coming, and thank you for moving up to the front. Since there's not so many of us, we wanted this to be a discussion anyway, so I think this will work very well. My name's Lori Shantz. I teach journalism at the University of Oregon, and this is part of a series of 5 panels that are exploring engagement issues and supported by the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon, which we call our gathering place for innovation and civic engagement. And we'd like to thank the International Journalism Festival for supporting this and for making our panels happen. I think what's been very interesting since I've been going to things when I'm not preparing this, is that these kind of issues about engaging with communities, about building trust with readers and viewers and listeners, this has been coming up in a lot of contexts, not just in the panels that are specifically labeled engagement. So I'm glad to see that, and I'm hoping we can add to the larger conversation. Business people, government workers, some politicians even, and also artists and musicians and a wide variety of the community all coming together to ponder this question. What is possible when the public and journalists engage to support communities to thrive? Literally, while I was taking students in the car to experience engagement, 180 miles south, a student walked into his English classroom at Umpqua Community College and fired. He shot 18 people, 9 of them died, 9 of them were injured. The gunman was killed on site. So while I'm on my way, I find out that 2 students are not coming to experience engagement anymore because they've been called by national media outlets to be freelancers. And having never covered a tragedy before, they got in the car and they drove south to Roseburg. And I knew they weren't the only people. That what happens when one of these high visibility shootings, tragedies happen, the media shows up. This was a small town, Roseburg, about 20,000 people, a very rural county, a timber industry. It's a timber town. When the logging went away, a lot of jobs went away. This is a county and a town that is so close-knit that the reporters at the local newspapers say you can't have anonymous sources because everybody knows who you're talking about every way. And what was happening was the entire national media was coming down there. And the juxtaposition was so strong, engaging with communities at these moments. One of the things that was striking is that the 19 journalists we talked to were unanimous. They said, I'm sorry? Not yet. The 19 journalists who we spoke with unanimously said that we are here because we want to support this community. We want to tell the stories of the victims so that they're not forgotten. We want to talk about the things that are happening right in this town. Who are the people? Were there heroes? Are there people helping? What's happening here? And they said they thought it was important to the community that their stories be told. What we discovered from interviewing people and from the communities is that the public disagreed with this and that they wanted the media to go home. And that the same reporters who were there to listen to stories and to try to help were actually causing harm. And a month after, Oregon Public Broadcasting did a piece, and they looked at, they interviewed people from the community and from the schools, and one of them said that the media had inflicted a second trauma upon the town of Roseburg. And that rather than doing good, that what they had done was they had caused problems. A year later, on the 1-year anniversary of this, there were campus security guards ticketing journalists who had come to cover the anniversary and putting on the tickets that said no media parking, even though the parking was for the public. They wanted them to go away.